Supercomputers marching along. And I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics, but I am fond of this graph. This has just been updated to 2007. So when I was a high school student, I bought something actually about 4 times the size of this for $50. I could switch one bit, telephone relay with support circuitry. 1968, I could buy a whole transistor for just $1 that could do the same thing, and it was a lot smaller and easier to use. You can buy 500 million of them now for $1. And okay, you've heard these fantastic comparisons, but again, look at how amazingly predictable this progression is. You know, this is not a government-mandated program. Well, if it were, it probably wouldn't look like this anyway. It's not some physics experiment on a tabletop. This is, again, the measure of millions of people's innovation. And as we made them cheaper, they're better because they're smaller, they run faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half about every year. What does that mean? That means 50% deflation in electronics. So you see that all the time. I mean, Apple comes out with an iPod that's twice as good for half the price. And it's not because Apple is so brilliant. They are brilliant at design. But that's true of all of electronics. And it's not just electronics. It's true of genetic sequencing data. The first genome cost $1 billion. NIH is now collecting 1 million genomes for $1 billion. It's true of brain data. It's true of bits being moved around on the internet and nodes on the internet. And every example, and now it's true of health and medicine in terms of all of the different aspects of the technologies you're talking about. How many respirosites we can build for $1 billion or $1. And all of these aspects are growing exponentially, and they have a 50% deflation rate. Now you can say, okay, information technology is this funny little portion of the economy that follows this strange curve, but it doesn't really affect the overall numbers. Well, actually, more and more of the economy is becoming an information technology. I mean, health and medicine, it's in an early stage, so it hasn't taken over all of it, but the cutting edge of it, and ultimately all of health and medicine, is becoming an information technology. That's $2 trillion a year just in this country. It's maybe 20% of our GDP. With the rest of the GDP collapsing, it's going to be, who knows. But more and more industries are becoming information technologies. Just a few years ago, if I wanted to send you a movie or a sound recording or a book, I would send you a FedEx package. Now I can send you an email attachment. And in the future, when we have desktop nanofactories that can produce a wide range of physical products from an information file by reassembling molecular fragments using massively parallel computation-controlled processes, I'll be able to email you a wide range of physical products as an information file, and you'll use inexpensive input materials to turn them into products like solar panels, like modules to build housing, like clothing, and so on. And ultimately, everything will become information technology. And economists worry about deflation, depending on what week of the year it is. They actually seem to be back on deflation. We had massive deflation during the Depression. That was because of a collapse of demand. We're seeing a collapse of demand again. But this deflation is from an increase in productivity and an increase in price performance. That's presumably a good thing, but some economists will say, well, if most of the economy is influenced by information technology and you get twice as much of it each year for the same cost, people aren't going to double their consumption year after year. Sure, if it's cheaper, you'll buy more, but you're not going to actually buy twice as much and keep up with that 50% deflation. So the size of the economy as measured in constant currency will shrink, and for a variety of actually good reasons, that would not be a good thing. But that's not what we see. We actually do double. We more than double our consumption of every form of information technology. In fact, every form of information technology has increased by 18% per year in constant dollars, despite the fact you get twice as much of it per dollar every year, and that's been true for the last half a century. And the reason for that is as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode on the landscape. I mean, people didn't buy iPods 15 years ago when they would have cost $10,000 each. So when that became cost effective, that exploded on the landscape. And people aren't going to buy respirosites at a quadrillion dollars a piece or even a quadrillion dollars per body. But when they cost $1,000, per body, that will explode on the landscape. I just put up magnetic data storage just because that's not Moore's law. It's not shrinking transistors on integrated circuits. It's shrinking magnetic spots on the substrate. Different engineers, different companies, different countries, same progression. This really is a phenomena that exists for any type of information technology. And the one that's really exciting to everyone personally is this biotechnology revolution and the nanotechnology revolution that will be built on it as we understand biology and how to extend it. And there really isn't a clear distinction, because as we see problems with biology, we can fix them either by reprogramming our DNA or changing proteins, or going beyond biology and adding structures that don't exist in biology. And we can learn a lot about how to do that by learning how biology works and how biology creates motility, for example, and stores energy, and use those secrets, but then go beyond them. And that's what engineering does. It takes subtle scientific insights and magnifies them, like the rays of the sun. I mean, consider Bernoulli's principle. It's a very subtle, very weak scientific principle that the air pressure is slightly different over a moving curved surface compared to a flat surface. Interesting, and they're still arguing why that is. But it's an interesting, subtle scientific insight. Well, engineering took that and created the whole world of aviation. So as we learn the secrets of biology, how it can provide energy and mobility, destroy pathogens, we can amplify them a millionfold and really overcome the limitations of biology. And DNA sequencing costs basically come down by around half. It's actually picked up speed recently. Every year it was $10 per base pair in 1990. It's a small fraction of a penny today. The amount of genetic data has approximately doubled every year. This continued past the end of the Genome Project, and now there are other projects like the Proteome Project to understand how the genome expresses itself in proteins and how the proteins interact with each other. And there has been a breakthrough recently in simulating protein folding, which is the key to biology. Communications technology, another example. This is updated to 2007. There were bits being moved around on the internet, doubling about every year. And this is a deeply democratizing technology. I wrote in the 1980s in my first book that the Soviet Union was doomed because if they provided their professionals with these workstations that were far more powerful than the copiers they were banning, they would destroy totalitarian control of information. If they didn't provide them, they would destroy their economy. I actually felt they would do a little bit of both, and that both would do them in. And that is what we saw in that coup against Gorbachev in '91, which marked the end of the Soviet Union. The photo op was Yeltsin bravely standing on a tank, but the tanks had nothing to do with it. It was a clandestine network of decentralized communication with early fax machines, early email on teletype machines, over phone lines that kept everybody in the know, and the paradigm of grabbing the central radio and TV station and keeping everybody in the dark didn't work anymore. And we saw a great wave of democratization during the 90s, really fueled by the rise of the World Wide Web. And these tools are also democratizing in terms of the tools of creative expression and disruptive technology, including in the biological field. But a kid in her dorm room now can create a full-length motion picture with high definition for using a $500 camera and her personal computer. And these tools are really in everybody's hands. I just got back from China. Half the farmers in China have devices in their pocket. They're called cell phones, but they're actually very powerful computers and communication devices. They can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. And they are actually creating a lot of disruptive technology. They've got very influential blogs. There's 100 million blogs in China. And this is the farmers of China. In Africa, cell phones are ubiquitous. And there are efforts now to create high-quality diagnostic and therapeutic recommendation systems using the increasingly ubiquitous communicators that everybody is carrying around. A couple of kids at Stanford wrote a little software as a dorm project, just a little experiment for fun on their $1,000 laptops, and created a company that's worth $100 billion today, even in today's economy, and you probably use it to search the web. So the tools of disruptive change are really in everybody's hands. You don't have to be a government agency or a large university or corporation in order to create these kinds of disruptive changes. And okay, this graph here, I had a little bit of this graph in the 1980s, first few points, and projected that we would see a World Wide Web emerging in the mid-1990s. If you look at the same graph on a linear scale, it looks like this. So to the casual observer, it looks like the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s, but you could see it coming if you look at the exponential progression. And if we look now at the exponential progression, we can see a lot of disruptive change, particularly in this field of biology, now that it's in information technology. And we're shrinking technology, according to my models, a factor of 100 per 3D volume per decade. And the progress we've seen in these conferences is really ahead of that curve. These are actually illustrations from Eric Drexler's book that Martine mentioned that have been animated and also have been simulated. And this is the RESPR site that you saw. And I've been talking with Rob Friedis about this for many years. It's exciting to see actual practical progress being made on this, and that we can get on exponential progressions where we can see really the end of the road for deploying these. And as was mentioned, that this is a fairly simple device because it doesn't require computation. It just requires delivering oxygen and carbon dioxide. But if you look at the progressions of what we can do now and apply them, we'll be able to put quite a bit of computation in 25 years in a blood cell size device. And we're showing that blood cell devices can perform therapeutic functions. That's already been demonstrated in animals. The whole issue of biocompatibility has been addressed in great detail. Not to say that we can just cross that off our list of concerns, but we have shown that it is feasible. Like Rob Friedis has written a whole book on biocompatibility, and that is a manageable issue. Power is a big issue, will continue to be. A lot of biology is based on that, but that's turning out to be a tractable issue too, particularly when we understand how biology deals with that issue. One of the more advanced projects or designs that Rob Friedis has conceived of is a robotic white blood cell, which does have computation and can be programmed and download software from the internet to combat specific pathogens, so it can be used for pathogens that it hasn't seen yet. And you know, if you think about what a white blood cell does, it's very clever, very intelligent, but it's actually very sluggish. I've watched one of my own white blood cells in a microscope, and it was quite clever. It actually blocked the escape route of a bacteria on the slide, and then kind of went around it and finally cornered it and devoured it, but it didn't do it that quickly. It took an hour, and it was a very boring thing to watch. So these devices can do that much more quickly, ultimately in seconds. They can be much more flexible. We can understand the limitations of our immune system in terms of autoimmune disorders and reprogram these devices around that. We'll have plenty of computation in the 21st century to do things like simulate the human brain. Key issue then is where will we get the software? The history of artificial intelligence is that most of the software has not come by understanding the human brain. And there have, in fact, been skeptics that we would ever learn anything from the human brain that would be of value in artificial intelligence. And I've had this long-standing argument with Tommaso Poggio, who's now head of the McGovern Brain Center at MIT. He was head of the Vision Lab for many years. And he said, we're not really learning much from the human brain that informs us in our machine vision projects. And I said, well, that's because you haven't modeled human vision yet. When you do, you'll learn something that will be of value. And that we learned a lot on speech recognition, which is another area of technology I've been involved in, when we got these early transformations, which were very non-intuitive about how the human brain processes auditory information. And he was skeptical. Well, when I saw him 2 years ago at AI 50, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1956 conference at Dartmouth that gave artificial intelligence its name, he said, you know, Ray, you were right. We've just have this great new model and simulation of the human visual system, and it was very non-intuitive. We applied those insights to our machine vision projects, and we got a big boost in performance. And that's one of the areas that we have now modeled and simulated, at least to some degree of specificity. And we're making exponential progress. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year. The amount of data we're gathering is doubling every year. And we are making very rapid progress in modeling and simulating different regions. This is a block diagram of 15 regions of the auditory cortex that are modeled, simulated, and tested. There have been psychoacoustic tests applied to the model and simulation. Get similar results applying those same tests to human auditory perception. Same thing for visual system that I just mentioned. Cerebellum has been modeled and simulated. This is an important region. It comprises more than half the neurons in the brain. It's where we do our skill formation, like catching a fly ball. I mean, how does a 10-year-old kid do that? I mean, what she sees is the ball going up in the air, and she knows to move her hand like this. Well, there's about a dozen simultaneous differential equations that have to be solved to make that connection. And last time I checked, most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. So how do they do that? Well, we actually understand now that cerebellum does solve those dozen simultaneous differential equations. It has to be trained in order to gain the parameters to solve the equations. That's why you have to practice the skill, and this has been modeled and simulated and tested. There are simulations of growing complexity of slices of the cerebral cortex. That's arguably the most important region. That's where we do this sort of magical thing that humans do of hierarchical thinking, where you can take a complex set of ideas or symbols and make one symbol out of it and then use that in another hierarchy. All of language is based on hierarchical thinking. And no other species does that as well. Chimpanzees do it a little, but they really are not over that threshold to create complex language structures like human beings. The sentences that they use in these experiments are fairly simple. That's done in the cerebral cortex, and we have simulations now that can begin to do that. So these simulations are scaling up exponentially. And, well, some people say, okay, the progress is exponential, but the goal is so far out that it'll still take centuries to get there because there's this vast complexity of the human brain. But the complexity is actually more than it appears. If I were to hand you the cerebellum and say, here, reverse engineer this for me, and you'd look at it and go, there's trillions, literally, of connections, and they're incredibly convoluted, and I'm never going to be able to figure this out. Well, we have figured it out. It's actually not that complicated. There's only a few genes that control it. There's only a few tens of thousands of bytes of information in those genes. And there's massive redundancy with a certain amount of stochastic process. So the genome says the following about the cerebellum. It says organize 4 neurons like this, and now repeats 10 billion times, add a little bit of random variation with each repetition within the following constraints. And that's what the genome says in summary about the cerebellum. And we have figured it out, and we have modeled and simulated it. The brain is a probabilistic fractal. And here's another fractal that you've seen. It's the Mandelbrot set. And this is it's a very complicated image, and there's some actually cool animations where you can zoom in on the Mandelbrot set, and it gets more and more complex, and there's never changing or always changing complexity within complexity. There's billions of bytes of information depending on the resolution that you display it with. It's on the cover of a book called Complexity. But the design of the Mandelbrot set is 6 letters long. The formula of the Mandelbrot set is 6 characters. And it's repeated iteratively, and you get these very complex structures. And if you add a little bit of randomness with each repetition, you get even more complex structures. And that's what the brain is. It's a probabilistic fractal. The amount of design information I show in Singularity is Near. It's about 25 to 50 million bytes, probably 25 million bytes. There's only 800 million bytes in the whole genome, but it's replete with redundancies. One sequence called ALU is repeated 300,000 times and comprises 3 or 4% of the genome, and there's other massive redundancies. And if you have redundancies, you can use lossless compression and reduce the amount of information. So the whole genome can be reduced to 50 million bytes, of which perhaps half describes the design of the brain. But it is implemented in a massively redundant, stochastic, probabilistic fashion. Now, that's not to say it's simple. 25 million bytes of this complexity with a great deal of three-dimensional interaction is complicated, but it's a level of complexity that we can manage, and we are managing. And I make the case in Singularities Near that we will have these models well within 20 years, in time for me to win my bet with Mitch Caper that an AI will pass a Turing test by 2029.